have to take a cautious and critical approach to governments who are wanting to cover up information and making these broad brush statements about damage to national security, about harming individuals, because they have incentive to cover up their own wrongdoing. And there is no evidence that anyone has been physically harmed as a result of WikiLeaks publications.
What are the chances of this appeal working then, Jennifer? How do you gauge the likelihood of him not being extradited at the end of this?
It's difficult to say, and it remains to be seen. We have strong appeal grounds. Of course, we're raising important issues of principle about free speech, about the right to fair trial, about the legality of this extradition request under the terms of the UK-US treaty. We think it's a strong appeal, but it has been refused in the past. It was refused at the end of last year. This is a renewal application for permission to appeal, and it remains to be seen what judges will do with it.
What's the moral case about him not going to America to face charges?
Well, of course, this is an important case of free speech. WikiLeaks and Julian Assange engaged in journalistic activity. These publications, dating back to 2010 and 2011, revealed evidence of war crimes, human rights abuse, were some of the biggest journalistic scoops in recent history, for which Julian's won awards the world over and been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize each year since. And he faces 175 years in prison for those very publications. As free speech groups have said, this is crossing a new legal threshold. It puts at risk First Amendment constitutional protections in the United States. It's having a chilling effect on public interest journalism. You've had New York Times, Washington Post out saying that this is criminalizing public interest journalistic practices. So it's setting a dangerous precedent, and not just for the United States, but for the world. I mean, what message does this send to Russia and China? We're seeing Putin now has Evan Gershkovich in prison on espionage charges, a journalist from the Wall Street Journal. And when people are asking questions of countries like of Putin, of Russia, of Azerbaijan, their response is, don't speak to us about free speech because you've got Julian Assange in your prison facing the same charges. So it's diminishing the moral authority of the UK, of Australia, of the United States, of Western liberal democracies who are involved in this case, to be able to raise these concerns globally.
What about the argument that the First Amendment is a huge protection in America? It is a very often cited and robust defense in law. Julian Assange should go to America and win the case in America based on his First Amendment rights. They have a free judiciary. You can largely trust the American judicial process. Should he not go and win this case in America?
Well, there's a couple of points to make about that. The first is that the US is arguing that as an Australian citizen, he won't benefit from First Amendment protections at all. And that's a dangerous position. So you've got the United States, which is seeking to exercise extraterritorial criminal jurisdiction over journalists and publishers outside of the US for publishing US information, and yet are arguing that because they're foreign citizens, they won't benefit from the First Amendment at all. That is a huge problem. Now, even if he were to be granted First Amendment rights, and they're saying that they won't, they're going to argue he shouldn't have them, the Supreme Court's not been great on free speech and national security. So the DOJ is absolutely running a prosecution theory that journalistic activity is a criminal offence. And so it could be 20 years before he ends up in the Supreme Court. But the second point to note is the accepted medical evidence in this case, which was expert evidence before the courts, which was accepted by the British courts, is that if he's extradited to the United States, because of his particular mental health picture, his autistic diagnosis and the prison conditions he'll face, that he'll be caused to commit suicide. So when his wife, Stella Assange, says this is a matter of life and death, Julian's life is at risk if he's extradited. So it's not just a matter of First Amendment, it's actually about a health question.
And what is his health like in prison in the United Kingdom?
His health has deteriorated significantly over the past 13 years that I've been representing him. We are very concerned about him. He is suffering from a depressive illness. He's in incredibly isolated conditions here in Belmarsh Prison, in a high security prison in the UK. But what he faces in the United States is far worse in terms of prison conditions, and we are very concerned about his security and his safety if he's extradited.
Did this get more complicated because of the Ecuadorian embassy? Because you have an Australian in Britain resisting extradition by the US, hiding in an Ecuadorian embassy. Does that make it hard? I mean, is the sort of the geographical mélange problem here? Does that make things harder or easier for you to make arguments about?
The history of Julian seeking asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy to protect himself from US extradition, which is what he did, and is the very outcome that he faced the moment that he was pulled out of the embassy by police. is that this is historic, but it does cause problems for him in terms of a bail application. So Julian has been in prison, which is very unusual. You wouldn't typically be held in prison for a US extradition request. He's been held in prison because of this history of having sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy. So if we are to get permission to appeal this week and the judges allow us permission to appeal, we're looking at a number of years ahead of appeal process, in which time he will be kept in prison. So whatever the outcome for Julian, whether it's extradition to the United States, which puts his life at risk, or remaining here in a prison in Belmarsh, none of these are happy outcomes for him.
And what is a good outcome then? What's the end game?
We are calling on the US government to drop the case. This is a case that should never have been brought in the first place. It was an indictment brought by the Trump administration under a president who called the media the enemy of the people. The Obama administration chose not to indict Julian because of what the so-called New York Times problem, which is the fact that the conduct that WikiLeaks has engaged in, Julian engaged in, which is on the terms of the indictment, is the same conduct that the New York Times engages in all day, every day. So this is a free speech problem. We want to see the US government drop this. We have the support of the Australian government. The Australian Prime Minister has made clear that he is raising this with Biden, that they want the case brought to an end. We would like to see it dropped and him be able to return home to Australia.
Is this a left-right problem? Because you have a new Australian government-ish, Labour government, pro-Assange. You talk about the New York Times, left-leaning paper. You talk about the Trump administration, obviously a Republican administration. Is this a case of the left versus the right?
Absolutely not. The political support for Julian we see across the political spectrum. In Australia, it's a bipartisan issue. So the Liberal government, our Tories, in fact, support a solution where Julian would be able to return home to Australia. And in fact, historically, the right has been better on free speech. So we've got libertarian leaders like Ron Paul out supporting Julian. So it's not a left or right issue. Free speech is a principled position that I think whether you're on the left or right, you need to get behind. If you believe in journalism and the importance of public interest journalism, then you ought to be supporting Julian Assange in this case.
What about the British political establishment? I mean, tell us about what you think the current Conservative governments think about this, and maybe they could do something. And then do you look ahead to a potential Keir Starmer premiership? You know, he comes from a judicial background. He's a former DPP. He has a sense of the nature of these things. Do you hold out hopes that he might put pressure on the US as the next Prime Minister, potentially?
Well, in terms of extradition requests in this country, the political discretion around an extradition request is quite limited. So the political spectrum here it's important I think it's important. The Australian government will be raising it with the British authorities about the treatment of an Australian citizen, him being held in prison here so long. And I do think that the British authorities need to consider that in looking at this case and in what this case means, not just for Julian Assange, but we've seen ads taken in the Times, in fact, by unions and free speech groups who are saying that this case means that the UK is no longer a safe place for media workers. And I think the British authorities and the British government, whoever is in government, need to be thinking about this and what this means for the UK and the precedent that this case is setting for all British journalists and editors.
And it's something that you think that if this is still going, which it will be with a changing government, you'd have to make that case again to a different government, potentially Keir Starmer.
Potentially, and we will continue to put this case. We will continually raise the principled free speech concerns, what this means for all British journalists and editors, and the media ought to be concerned about this. This is a precedent that will affect them. It's effectively the United States saying that wherever you are in the world, if you publish truthful information about the United States, you could face extradition and prosecution in the United States.
Just on the moral question, truthful information is one thing. Information that might endanger the lives of others is another thing. It can be both. It can be both truthful and also endanger the lives of other people. Does Assange himself recognise any moral complexity in this area, that he released information with a semi-political end? I know it started out very free speech in its purest sense, but it did feel like he had a political agenda at certain stages in this operation. Does he accept that there is at least some moral questions to be asked and answered about the effect of exercising free speech in this very absolute way?
Of course, Julian made very clear in these initial publications for which he's being prosecuted that his political aim was to hold governments accountable. And so to the extent that he has a political aim, that is transparency, and it's holding governments accountable for wrongdoing. Now, Julian also took measures and reduction measures with WikiLeaks and sought the input of the United States government to protect against those risks, to protect against risk to life and to protect against risk to national security in those publications. And indeed, the New York Times and the newspapers had an ongoing conversation with the United States in the course of that publication. And so I think it's also important to, a lot is said about, the risk to lives because of these publications. On the US government's own evidence before this extradition case, there is not evidence of one person being physically harmed as a result of these publications. And so I think we have to take a cautious and critical approach to governments who are wanting to cover up information and making these broad brush statements about damage to national security, about harming individuals, because they have incentive to cover up their own wrongdoing. And there is no evidence that anyone has been physically harmed as a result of WikiLeaks publications.
Just finally, Jennifer, do you worry that he might die in prison? That there's a version he could die in prison in the UK or the US?
I am very concerned about it. I've been worried about his health for a long time. I'm worried about his mental health. And it's a serious situation for him to be in. He's isolated most of the day. He's facing this incredibly serious prospect of US extradition. And we are very worried about him.
Could you get him out of Belmarsh, Jennifer? Because Belmarsh is a high security prison it houses some of the most serious offenders in this country, as people will know. Could he be put somewhere better than that?
As you point out, the absurdity of me having to go and visit an award-winning Australian publisher and journalist in a high-security prison with terrorists and convicted murderers is an absurd situation in a democracy. But that's the prison he's been allocated. Our bail applications have been denied, and so that's where he'll remain while we continue to fight this.
And he'll be there even if you win today. He's there for a while.
Even if we win this week, if we win, he'll remain in Belmarsh while we fight that appeal.
Well, it's an amazing story, and it's been very interesting hearing you explain it so clearly, Jennifer. Thank you so much for taking the time.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on.